I would invite you to go back in the hallway. We've set up 5 tables with 5 flip charts. Your work will be to answer 3 questions that you see here, points to discuss. I mean, you come from different cities. Do you have common initiatives in some of your cities? And what are the differences in what you've heard, what's been presented in terms of structure? This is work that you're doing for us. This is going to help us at a later stage to guide you. And then we're going to ask you, in the light of your experience, okay, you've heard all this, and what do you see as elements that will be facilitating, and others that will be obstacles? And the third question is a major one for our research program, and it is, how will this mobilization better take into account the issues at stake? I'd like you to identify a rapporteur for the plenary. We're going to give you half an hour, and then we'll bring you back in here, and we'll have 5 rapporteurs to listen to. And then all opinions will be valid in the plenary. So I'd invite you to go next door right away.
And I just don't think we're there as a society in BC. It's something like there's no civil servant working on this area.
C'est nommé, mais il n'y a pas d'action financée pour ça. C'est nommé.
On avait besoin justement de donner
des infrastructures, ils se font quand même des petites affaires, c'est entièrement vrai. Et c'est
The parent group was called what?
Mais de l'autre côté, répondre à certaines attentes.
So I'm going to go first. I had a diverse group of English-speaking representation from St. John's, from Montreal, from Saskatoon, and from Vancouver. So we covered the province in our discussions. I'm going to we all named a partnership that was similar to this in our settings. We noticed differences and similarities in terms of scope, both topically, some included more topics, and geographically, was it a city or regional? Differences in terms of funding, which I'll come back to, and differences in terms of how long a partnership has existed. So some started last week, and some started up to 10 years ago. Okay, so the country has different partnership arrangements. Maybe I'll focus on factors that we thought were sort of those core factors that were facilitative or hindrances. The hot topic was funding. So is there funding at all? Which in some cases was no. An important conversation about whether the funding was regional, municipal, provincial. A comment that funding was needed for coordination if this thing was actually going to work, and for stability if it was going to last for a long time. But with funding diversity came diversity of interests and priorities, which was an additional challenge with growth. A next one would be about labeling things as health. So the language that's used fit better in different partnerships and contexts. Other words that were, so some intersectoral partners perceived that this as health was taking over, so others used words like safety and accessibility, wellness, happiness, really anything other than health in some of these settings. Another one about scale and scope. So I mentioned that when they got bigger, the diversity may be inclusive, but it may bring a lack of focus and ability to action on things, and that was observed over the life cycle of a partnership as well. The life course of the partnership and its identity at any given place, how people saw it. So a lot of these start from grassroots and require grassroots skill sets, and as they grow, they've been so successful that maybe it needs to move on and become institutionalized, but that is an uncomfortable phase. So I think that covers the main parts about this. We talked about questions of equity, not with respect to the MMS, but more generally. A couple of take-home points from the conversation, inclusion at the planning table, and that is not just with a single group, so Aboriginal, not just about us, or nothing about us without us, but other groups as well, making sure every group was at the planning table from the outset. Looking at every performance indicator within a lens of equity for the appropriate strata. So are we doing that? Which lenses are appropriate for the partnership? That equity is considered in terms of its local and social context, so not only at traditional sort of social determinants of health, but within Vancouver, the talk of an excluded generation. So when we talk about homelessness and we talk about social housing, but we also just talk about housing affordability for all of those employed people out there, including the lawyers who can't afford houses in Vancouver. So local context important really when we're talking about equity. And we remarked that Vancouver, Saskatoon, and Montreal seem to be very equity focused at the forefront of their efforts, more so maybe than other cities not represented at our group. But a need to move away from sort of dichotomous perspectives on equity or simple gradients to looking at intersectionality. So at the group, in cities where we're already considering this, to really get intersectionality looped into there and just looking at that with your performance indicators too. Have I missed anything?
Okay. I'll try to give a little snapshot of the discussions because my notes were not perfect. At the table we had people from Montreal, Saskatoon, me from Toronto, and we had others which I'll say were non-aligned. They represented not necessarily one of the major cities. I think in terms of, are there similar initiatives to Montréal Métropole en Santé? I think the answer was no, but we have many components that are similar, but we don't necessarily have something that integrates both the active living and the food as getting partnerships across different sectors. We didn't have, so they tend to be more single focus, like food policy councils that focus just on food, and other people focusing just on mobility, not necessarily looking at both. In terms of experiences, factors that can facilitate or hinder sort of these kinds of actions, one point that was raised, that trust between the actors is what facilitates sort of interchange, and that is something that needs to be built and takes time to be built. In terms of hindrances, the structures in which we work. And quite often what happens is that each partner that is around the table has a mandate. So it falls within my mandate, I can do it. Doesn't fall within my mandate, I cannot do it. So how do we get permission to do things that are outside our mandate? And that can become more difficult for certain actors within a partnership, and therefore how do we work through those? Clearly as well, we also talked a bit about sort of the importance of micro and macro, and how one leads to the other, and finding ways that it becomes a true cycle is maybe one of the challenges. The micro is important because it allows for innovation, allows for more sort of integration and the grassroots into things, but then how to mobilize that and change that into macro and still keep sort of the input. And the input really becoming, again, as we've mentioned, for the equity aspect is making sure that all the voices take part. So having all the voices take part of the micro might be a bit easier than as a macro. But it's the challenge I think we need to address in terms of truly sort of making sure that equity is really integrated. We have to find that kind of way. I'll stop here unless there's somebody else somebody else thinks they want to say.
On était
afternoon. There were 4 of us from Montreal and Rachel from Saskatchewan. Perhaps we focused too much on Montreal, but we did partially answer the first question by stating that in Saskatchewan, as is the case in Montreal, public health and the city administration are 2 separate things. Sometimes you have to, when you have to deal with the two administrations, it might be complicated. We wanted to look if there was anything that looked like Montreal's Métropole en Santé, and there was the city of Saskatoon. They were looking at funding a food policy council. And after that, we looked at the micro-macro relationship at length. We wanted to see what would truly influence the citizens and their life environment. Was a local intervention sufficient, or should we be able to deal with more structuring problems? How can we get sufficient funding to go to the higher level? So there was a simple example that was given. For instance, when you're working on active transportation in a neighborhood, it becomes easy enough to work in a smaller area because the rules are locally managed, except other than at a larger level, it's the city that has to be involved. So we need to have a presence of both of these environments so that they're both heard. The third question, the equity issue, we approached it under the heading of the living wage or minimum guaranteed. And again, in terms of the structuring issue, cooperative grocery in Saskatchewan, for example, where there was a real need for having that stay open. 3 years later, the grocery store had to close because the need as such in the population from the financial point of view was economically challenged. They had to close after 3.5 years so that we have to deal with the economic viability in order to ensure secure food, nutrition. Our discussion around our table, we had people who were with Montréal Métropole en Santé, and there were others. We were all from Montreal, so we talked intrinsically, almost, as to how the new initiatives compared to the old, and the committees that were meeting under MMS. The issue of competing for funding, to have 2 avenues that were in the bag. There with MMS, the funding is paired with strategic programming. To have this single funding, we don't have any competition for financing, and perhaps we can trigger coherent programming. In the second question, we realize that to have organizations that all have their own agenda, they have to stick to their agenda. That's normal. But how can we develop more cohesive programming and to ensure that the structures will be appropriate? But there has to be participation and buy-in. One of the difficulties in having the participation of representatives from the municipalities that wasn't always uniform. And at the strategic level, they're involved and mobilized, but in terms of higher up governance, we noticed that the districts were not always present. Another thing that we had noticed is that the distribution and handling of the files was not uniform in the various arrondissements, neighborhoods, and even the files that were cohesive for us in public health are not in the central city, isn't given to one single person. So are we properly informed through these people? How can we bring agendas together? And the idea of combining agendas depends on the kind of participation that we have. Participation in the working groups will change depending on whether we realize that we're having an impact on certain issues of inequality, for instance. So there's that aspect, which also causes us to think, what is the usefulness in all of this? Everybody has to find their own usefulness to be properly informed about the usefulness and feasibility of certain projects. There's also participation for community organizations. There's the advantage, this is at the very root of everything, the participation of these organizations has to make them stronger rather than weaker. And at the same time, they have to play a role of in structuring the agenda, which may be a disadvantage that we see in the MUSE project. The main users are the people from the institutional users in public health, but we've seen that there are a number of events that we have to evaluate. We must make sure that we're producing knowledge and that the knowledge is shared with these organizations, and also the funding issue, and that the strategic planning follows a public agenda, public health being among them. So the conclusion that we reach is that there are difficult issues in combining all of these agendas, but particularly in public health, where we have to rely on past experience. And in the criteria, there are new criteria that have been developed. Some of the criteria are shared. The role of institutional public health is to share tools and to make sure that the various environments are tooled up and that we are well informed about equity, that we're not reduced to noticing inequalities. So that, wrapped up by me personally, is a summary of the discussions that we've had, and I invite the people who were at our table to share their own experience.
Thank you for those summaries. I think everybody's very happy about them. I found that you were very polite with regards to Montréal et en santé. Didn't you identify any caveat or difficulties? Something you'd like to flag? Patrick had something, I think, in terms of maybe the power struggles or something like that. Louise? There's this whole issue in public health of reforms. People are stuck with reforms all across the country, whereby they have to, so they sort of report to the healthcare level, and that has important impacts on the opportunities that we could have in public health, insofar as there could be variables between the various systems. In other words, the Montreal MCMOH no longer has the same leeway as he used to have to speak with politicians, for instance. We're going to ask him what he thinks. Maybe he doesn't agree with you. Maybe he's criticized more than he used to be. But if you look at structures, in Canada, people have been talking about that, writing about this. But the fact that public health is now integrated within the healthcare system creates conditions that could potentially impact that type of initiative. It might be useful to see how this type of initiative under the leadership of public health organizations could be better developed, but also hindered by the reforms, which means that public health organizations have less leeway. Well, I have to react to this. First, I don't think that the CMOH in Montreal, which reports to the network, is limited because it's part of the healthcare network, because we've been part of that network, by that system for a long time. But we will not become lobbyists. We won't be the ones who will advocate for one single option. The interest of those coalitions like ours is that we can impact and be impacted. It's not just one way, it's both ways, huh? So we can impact and be impacted, and we can talk about a common theme, so we are maybe more listened to and our information can be validated. Of course, we can use scientific knowledge, we can use the literature, we can develop options. Some people are extremely good at this, but being able to be in the field with people who are putting these things into application, being able to see the limits, the issues, being able to talk about feasibility, all this is key when time comes to talk with politicians. Now, if we talk about the political side, the less you're known, the more vulnerable you are as a CMOH. If you are in a region where he's not listened to, and I'm speaking on behalf of the region of Montérégie. It's a big region with a lot of capacities, but they didn't develop their listening skills as much as they could have because of the media. So if those listening, this attention, this listening opportunities, if it's not there, well, it's more difficult. The more you are listened to, let's say in the media, the more you have an influence and the more respected you are. It's harder for ministers and mayors to ignore what we say as CMOH. As long as we remain in our field, if we leave our field of competencies, I'm talking about health knowledge, we won't become lobbyists. We're not paid to be lobbyists. Our platform is adequate and we can use it much more efficiently through that kind of coalition. But yes, there are limits, there are constraints. And if we don't use the impact we can have, we lose an opportunity. And the less we use it, the less leeway we have. And my predecessor and my successors will have to address these things. We'll have to see what can we do in order to have a credible platform where we will keep our leeway. It requires a certain political courage. I'm not a politician, I don't want to be one, but it requires political courage. You have to defend people's opinions. Your credibility will be the credibility that people will give you because they feel that you're willing to represent them, to advocate for them. We advocated social housing, for instance. People know that when we talk about social housing, it's not just pretend. We're really serious about it. And then we become credible. Well, maybe I'm digressing, but I just wanted to say that coalitions are a tool that goes both ways. It's very important, but there are real limits. But coalitions won't tell us what to say, and we won't tell the coalitions what to say. I wouldn't believe in this. There has to be active exchanges. Maybe I shouldn't have said that at this stage, I don't know. Maybe it wasn't a very timely intervention. Well, that's not what I felt. Nazim?
Thank you very much, Louise, for the proactive question, and thank you, Richard, for that very important, intervention. As I was listening to you, prompted by the question, I was thinking, that's a question here. And maybe this is, the research question might be in 4 cities that is represented by the leadership of public health in an environment where public health is changing in the larger provincial, healthcare delivery, which is the question, how do the CMHOs or the MHO office and that mandate maintain credibility and push for change at the local and the regional and provincial level? How do we do that? How do we do that? Do we do that with knowledge, research projects and so forth? Do we do that through personality, power of personality? Do we do that with, with partners that you have, not 50, like the critical partners you have who are all mobilizing, into the certain message. How do we do that? I think that's a research question, in all of this, in that exchange, in this exchange, there's a research question.
Je suis désolé de devoir contredire le Richard.
I'm sorry I have to contradict Richard, but I believe that the partnership with the city cannot have no impact on our message, on our activities. And over the past 15 years, I've seen that some information can be obtained, some can't. I respect the reason why it can't be obtained, because sometimes it's a question of quality of relationships between the PHO and the city in other fields, and I respect that, but I don't agree. I don't understand. Well, maybe it's just because I don't understand. When you say a partnership like this one wouldn't have an impact on our messages. If there's no formal partnerships, some messages cannot be conveyed. There might be good reasons. It's a question of, protecting the quality of our relationships with the city. Do you understand? Yes, I understand perfectly what you're saying. Mylène spoke about the capacity to absorb the evidence, capacity or not. This is what she was referring to, and maybe it would be a good idea to expand on this. Patrick produces very good evidence, so we should expand on this. Any other words of caution for Montréal Métropole en Santé? Daniel and Michel. A word of caution would be with Montréal Métropole en Santé and the other project. It's a question of impact, because we carry out projects, we do things for healthy eating and physical activity, but do we measure the impact? How do we measure it? And with the MUSE project, if we try to assess the multi-sectoral relationships between organizations with no impact, what will the impact of our research be? So, yeah, that's my question. Michel? About what you just said, we focus on the description and benchmarking rather than the evaluation of impacts, but maybe with the partnership with the Interact team that was mentioned, we could see if there would be specific actions or advocacy work. If in the Interact team people are interested in assessing the impacts of that, maybe we can discuss it further later on. But for now, we were talking about description and benchmarking and sharing the outcomes, the results of these things. Okay? It's a question of choosing the multi-sectoral groups. That's a question that was asked this morning. Will we take into consideration the potential impact of collaboration when we will choose the groups, for instance? I agree, Lise, maybe that is not a question of measuring the impact of the MUSE project, but we do have to evaluate the groups we will be collaborating with. So your suggestion is, beyond what's been said, let's make sure, well, earlier we said that social inequalities could be an inclusion or exclusion criterion for our partners. If they don't address social inequalities, maybe we wouldn't be interested. But a second element would be that we should have the feeling that those partnerships could have a large impact or an important impact. Michelle and Megan, I think. This question of the power struggle is a key and very complex question. I don't know how you will deal with it. I've been Deputy Minister of Health in Canada for 5 years. I worked on the new reproduction technology report, the Canadian Act on tobacco or smoking, all sorts of really easy topics. The question of contaminated blood, for instance. And I did write on this, the relationship between research and civil society and decision makers. I mean, that was extremely complex. I don't know what you picked up in that, but still I did like what Richard said, because it's a sort of a checks and balances, right? It's not easy to do, but we cannot overlook this problem of power struggles. It's everywhere. Always someone wants to be in power. And I was in feminist groups. We used to publish a magazine, and I would say, okay, we have to publish next week, so let's go faster. Oh, you won't be the one taking the power tonight. It exists. It's there among decision makers. I mean, it's a fact. And over the past years, what's been changing is this idea of integrating evidence. Now, the relationship between the researcher, the politician, the deputy minister, and so on, is a complex issue. And I think now a politician, a decision maker, has 4 years. First year, he looks for the washroom. Second, he wants to put things in place. And third year, he starts thinking about elections. So I worked with about 15 ministers. It is an extremely important question. And it will always be a fact. It will always be present. I don't have any answers. I just wanted to say that. But I think that this discussion is very rich. Other comments? There's 5 minutes left. Let's talk about equity. In Montréal Métropole en Santé, there's a equity criterion with regards to funding. Is it easy, after the fact, to integrate that in a coalition which did not address it ahead of time in its mission, for instance? Is it easy to implement that later on in the process? Do you think it will be feasible, or are there any tips that we can hear about? Yeah. It's a big challenge. It's important to address it. I'm going to give you a concrete example. Yesterday, I was with UQAM. There's a research on urban agriculture being conducted. We are mapping all the initiatives in Montérégie and in Montreal, and there's a researcher from the Portland, Oregon University who presented a research on the impact, because we say, oh, agriculture will be good for the city, for the communities in Montreal, and what he saw in Portland is that it was great for the gentrification of a neighborhood. So we all believe that agriculture is a good thing for the city. So yes, we need evidence-based studies. For instance, yes, we're going to do agriculture all over the city. Be careful, because there can be adverse effects. Hence the importance of evidence-based data. And we have to be very vigilant. Can we operationalize equity? Are we equipped to do it?
Milan, je vais te demander de compléter le...
Milan, when you talk about this criterion of equity, it's something that was added on. It wouldn't have been part of the recipe if we hadn't insisted. So it's fragile. People don't really understand why, how, what it means. But that's our job to do that. It's our job to explain it to people in a clear language so people understand what it means. And then there's buy-in. Maybe you want to add something to that? Yes. And it's public health that brought it on, even if in the wording it said for all, but once you've seen this, how do you integrate it? It is difficult also because groups have action plans. SAM, Montréal Physiquement Active. So there's an action plan that was drafted several years ago, and the priorities and the working groups, urban agriculture and so on, were not designed with that in mind, with equity in mind. So we find ourselves with different stakeholders working on all sorts of specific issues, and then we add that angle, that actor. Sometimes there are, for instance, school-based projects or other projects where equity was included, but the projects weren't designed with that in mind. So it's a little hitch. So now we have to adapt the discussion, and we had to produce, because of the of our funding organizations, we had to integrate that in our criteria. We had to do it fast, but developing competencies and training people so that the group can become mature and make choices with equity in mind. I mean, it doesn't take 6 weeks in a multi-sectoral setting. So we say that maybe in the next action plan, we want to be even better, and hopefully our people will have been trained. So if you have any tools to suggest, we will be glad to hear you on that. Connie wants to share her tools, maybe.
I was just signaling to say, yes, we'll follow up and give you some tools. We'd love to.
So just in response to that, I think in thinking back to multiple projects in Saskatoon, we could, as public health, go to the project and speak about the importance of equity, see nods around the table and understanding, and then the planning groups would go away, and usually equity wasn't incorporated, despite a head knowledge. There wasn't a adaptation or buy-in at the heart. And so we had to ensure there was an equity champion named to every working group if we wanted it to, keep being thought of. And when we did that, invested that time, slowly the projects would just become natural. And you reach a saturation point when everyone becomes an equity champion, but that takes time, and you have to invest. But the other way we found to ensure was to first of all bring data to the planning table to show that equity is an underlying problem with this issue, so that people have the data in front of them. But then part of the ongoing monitoring and evaluation includes feedback as to whether equity issues are being addressed. And if that's continually coming back, it's hard for people to forget as well. So, those are just some examples of tools. Connie's got a lot more that can be shared, but I agree, it's without being intentional, it's very easy for it to be dropped.
On revient à 1h30.
Oui, à 13h30. Alors, bon appétit. Merci.